And joining us now in studio to discuss ongoing efforts to protect and sustain the environment in Africa is Sandra Nichols, co-director of the Africa program at the Environmental Law Institute here in Washington. Ms. Nichols is a lawyer whose specialty includes post-conflict natural resources governance. She just returned from a year-long visit to Liberia, and we welcome you to Africa 54.
Thank you, Demi.
So your organization deals essentially with trying to promote sound environmental law, policy and management in Africa, and it has introduced some kind of a toolkit for environmental advocacy. Can you explain what that is all about?
The Environmental Law Institute works with partners to try to accomplish their environmental goals using best practices of law and policy. We help them to develop new laws and policies, and we help them to understand the best ways of accomplishing their objectives.
Now, you just came from Liberia, and part of your focus is to do with post-conflict natural resource governance. What is your experience in Liberia? What exactly are you trying to help them do in terms of protecting the environment?
Well, the Environmental Law Institute observed that coming out of civil wars, there are great threats and great opportunities to the environment during that period. So it's an area that the Environmental Law Institute has been focusing on to try to identify ways to take advantage of that opportunity. And after a few years of studying those issues and looking at case studies from around the world, and in fact, building on the Environmental Law Institute's work in Liberia on environmental issues, I wanted to go and try to help the government put those lessons into practice.
Give us something tangible. What specifically about environment protection?
In Liberia, all their economy is very much based on natural resources extraction. So it's a question of balancing economic development with environmental management and conservation. And the big issue in Liberia is about forests. Forests played a big role in their civil war, and forests are promising to play a big role in their economic redevelopment. And there have been some improvements in forest management, and there have been also some continued challenges.
What are the challenges that you can share with us?
Environmental management, just like essentially every other issue in a government, in a country, comes down to a question of governance. And while there is a great, in Liberia in particular, there really is a great willingness to try to improve and have a more equitable society and a more environmentally friendly society, there still are kind of historical patterns that favor certain groups and don't necessarily result in the application of the law, including environmental protections.
I want to go to the basics. You know, you have a lot of people in Liberia. You mentioned how forestry is such a big part of it. Energy supply is obviously very low, and a lot of people count on the wood to cook and do whatever.
Absolutely.
So how do you introduce an environmental policy in that kind of an environment where there's no alternative really? And what's the government's commitment to ensuring that that need is met?
That's a very big challenge, and just as you say, almost all of the population depends on charcoal, which is almost all harvested illegally. So it's a question of providing infrastructure, which takes a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Africa continentally wide, what is the government commitment to fighting climate change through sound environmental policies?
For anyone, anywhere, within governments, their commitment comes from understanding. And in Africa, the understanding of these issues really varies. I think that it's increasing and commitments are increasing. But again, decision by decision, it comes down to the balance between economics and environmental issues. And it's not always understood that protecting the environment is better for the economy in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Just very briefly, are you encouraged by what you at least saw in Liberia where it comes to not only protecting the environment, but also the people and sustaining that
That's the
balance?
lesson that I took away from my experience in Liberia, is that the only way that anything can change is with a sort of social, cultural change within governments and within populations. And in Liberia, there are still substantial challenges, but there's also a big group of people who are serious about improving the environment and improving the future.
Well, thank you so much for coming in to share that information with us.
Thank you.
And that's Sandra Nichols, co-director of the Africa program at the Environmental Law Institute here in Washington.